60 years ago today, the Beatles released an album that would not only signal a whole new direction for the band, but ultimately a whole new direction for music in general. So today we're going to go track by track, diving into how the Beatles wrote and recorded Revolver, an album that is widely considered to be one of the most important albums of all time. In April 1966, the Beatles learned that although they were earning lots and lots of money, the vast majority of it was going to the taxman. Due to the UK's super tax on high earners at the time, the Beatles were getting taxed at the rate of 95%, which is why we get the lyric, "There's one for you, 19 for me," and this lyric as well. "Should 5% appear too small, be thankful I don't take it all." Taxman is the first George Harrison track to open a Beatles album. George was particularly upset about how much money the Taxman was taking from them, in particular as that money was then going to be spent on war machines by the government. He name-checks both Prime Minister Harold Wilson and the leader of the opposition Edward Heath in the song. Taxman uses a very blues-inspired harmonic language, which is a fancy way of saying it uses loads of dominant chords. The A section is basically just a vamp on D dominant 7, with the sharp 9 occasionally thrown in. 5% appear too small. Now, the Beatles were no strangers to blues-driven harmony, but it may be that Taxman received its blues-based harmony from another man, Batman. Of course, there's a clear likeness between Taxman and Batman in this moment here, where the Beatles declared Taxman's name. The Batman is a 12-bar blues composition, so if Taxman did begin as basically just a play on the Batman theme, then it would make sense that Taxman had that similar blues feel. The Batman TV series had come out earlier that year in the US, and although it hadn't reached the UK yet, we know that George Harrison owned a copy of the Marquette's cover version of the Batman theme thanks to a subscription the Beatles had where they would receive all of the new entries into the American charts. Now, although Taxman is a George Harrison penned tune, the Beatle who really shines on this record is Paul McCartney. Not only does he provide the fat, energetic bass line, but he also provides the shredding guitar solo as well. Now, Taxman is a fairly straightforward arrangement, but it seems that earlier on there were some extra little details that the Beatles chose to remove from the final version. If we listen to one of the earlier takes, take 11, we can hear that there's a few extra details that didn't make it to the final version, including these additional high guitar notes, this fast-paced backing vocal, and the song also had a more sort of traditional ending. Now, the conventional wisdom is that an album should have a cohesive sound from beginning to end. But that is very much not true on this record, or many Beatles records for that matter, because we move from the brash, high-energy, bluesy Taxman to the melancholy string octet of Eleanor Rigby. Look at all the lonely people. It's easy today to take Eleanor Rigby for granted, but if you think back to 1966, this is a pop band releasing a track which is purely 8 strings players with vocals on top. This is pretty much unprecedented for the time. You'd had singers perform over orchestras before. When I fall in love. But this isn't an orchestra, this is a double string quartet, creating more of a chamber music sound. And of course the Beatles had done something similar the year prior with Yesterday, but Yesterday was a guitar with a string quartet. Now we don't have a guitar, we just have the strings and voice. Now, of course, this chamber music string octet arrangement was created by the Beatles' producer, George Martin. Eleanor Rigby was originally based on just a few guitar chords, so George Martin really breathed a whole new life and sound into this song, creating this sophisticated arrangement full of counter melodies that bounce off of Paul McCartney's lead vocal. We can get an insight into how George Martin conducted and produced the strings for this track in this rare studio outtake, where we can hear George Martin and the players demonstrating to Paul McCartney 2 options: no vibrato on the strings or vibrato.
Listen to this, Paul. This is without vibrato on the rhythm bit, you know. 3, 4, G, B. Now the same as you were with vibrato. 3, 4. Can you tell any difference?
Not much.
As you heard from the clip, Paul didn't really have a preference over either, so the strings players themselves and George Martin decide to go with the no vibrato option, and you can even hear one of the strings players suggesting they make it more marcato, i.e. more marked and accented.
It sounded better without.
I thought it did actually.
Yes. It sounded better
Sounds
without.
better without. Yes. Especially if we make it more
Cleaner, yes.
marcato. Too. It's a slightly more mechanised, George.
Let's do it now.
This song is a dark observational tale following these two characters, Eleanor Rigby and Father Mackenzie.
Eleanor Rigby picks up the rice in the church where a wedding is.
As Paul has explained in interviews, the character of Eleanor Rigby embodies the lonely little old ladies he knew in his community when he was growing up. The sort of people who wander around churchyards and live quiet, forgotten about lives and then pass away and have a funeral only attended by the vicar. The lyrics of the song really paint a picture in your mind. They tell a story, complete with beginning, middle and end. The first verse introduces us to Eleanor Rigby, a lonely lady who doesn't attend weddings, but merely picks up the rice that was thrown at them.
Picks up the rice in the church where a wedding has been. Lives in a dream.
The second verse then introduces us to another lonely character, Father Mackenzie, who presumably was at the wedding, but he himself is also lonely, writing the words of a sermon that no one will hear.
No one comes near, look at him working, darning his socks.
And then the third and final verse brings these two lonely people together, but in a twist of tragic irony, only because Father Mackenzie conducts Eleanor Rigby's funeral.
Father Mackenzie, wiping the dirt from his hands as he walks from the grave.
Now, it's not just the dark narrative giving this song its spooky vibe, it's also the melody. The melody flits between two different versions of the minor scale, one that's called the Dorian mode and one that's called the natural minor or Aeolian mode. Dorian is just like the minor scale, but it has a raised 6th degrees. That means we have a C sharp here. So this part of the song is in the Dorian mode, which has a minor sound, but a slightly brighter minor sound. It's sort of whimsical and intriguing.
Eleanor Rigby picks up the rice in the church where a wedding.
But then this is sharply contrasted by the very next line that defaults to the more conventional C natural here, the Aeolian mode, a darker minor sound.
Lives in a dream, waits at the window.
Now, another significant thing to think about with Eleanor Rigby is that this is a song that very much couldn't be performed live by the band, but that didn't matter because they were no longer going to tour. In 1966, the Beatles made the unprecedented move to stop touring, despite being the biggest band in the world. But after 3 years of slogging it around the world and often having very unpleasant experiences, the band decided to become a studio band, which really was what makes this album the turning point for the Beatles' career and in many ways the music industry full stop, because it suddenly threw off the idea that an album is a representation of a live performance and instead allowed the band to make music that could purely just be for listening and not reproducing. The songs on this album were developed and rehearsed in the studio, recorded there and then never performed again by the band. These are songs that treat recorded music as a different medium entirely to live music, a distinction that today we often take for granted. And the next track on this album, track 3, very much follows that trend of not being able to be performed live. Largely a conventional composition, the element of I'm Only Sleeping that makes it an unperformable song is the backmasked guitar solo. Backmasking just means reversed. This is how the guitar solo sounds on the record. And this is it unreversed, i.e. the way it would have sounded when it was performed. A simple enough technique to just stumble across, i.e. just by putting the tape on backwards on the machine, reversing their music was something that John Lennon in particular had fallen in love with recently. The band had debuted the technique on their track Rain, which had been released as the B-side of Paperback Writer earlier that year. Now, although this song is very forward-thinking in the way it was recorded, with its reverse guitar solo, from a harmonic and melodic perspective, i.e. the chords and melody, it's a very traditional song, very old-fashioned. The song is based in the key of E minor, but for the bridge section we modulate to the closely related key of A minor. This subtle type of key change, moving to what we call a closely related key, a key that shares 6 out of 7 of the same notes, is a very old-fashioned technique and something that we saw the Beatles do a lot in their earlier songs like I Wanna Hold Your Hand or From Me to You. So far on Revolver we've had a George Harrison track, a Paul McCartney track, a John Lennon track, and now we go back to have another George Harrison track. Although the title of this song, Love You Too, is a reference to the band's first single, Love Me Do, musically it couldn't really be any more of a departure from the band's original sound. Although George Harrison had included the Indian instrument the sitar on Norwegian Wood the year prior, Love You Too, here in 1966, is George Harrison's first proper venture into the world of Indian classical music.
Each day just goes so fast.
Not only did this track make extensive use of Indian instrumentation like sitar, tabla and tambura, but the song's treatment of harmony, melody and structure was also heavily influenced by the Indian style. Rather than being based on a chord progression like most Western pop music, Love You Too is instead based on a static drone of one note. A tambura sustains a root note of C throughout the entire composition. This is very typical of Indian classical music. Indian classical music doesn't really have chords or harmony per se. Instead, one constant note is droned as a key center, whilst other melodic instruments will explore a raga above. A raga or rag is much like what Western musicians would call a scale, and most ragas use the exact same notes as a Western music scale, like the major scale, the Mixolydian scale, or the Dorian scale. Love You Too uses the Kafi raga, which is actually the equivalent to our Western Dorian scale. Another element of Love You Too, which is drawn straight from the Indian tradition, is its structure. Love You Too opens in the same way that much Indian music does, with an alap section. An alap is a short introductory section, usually in free time, where the key center and raga are established. This section is often followed by the gat. Although Indian classical music is usually improvised, it will sometimes feature a gat, which is a set pre-composed section, often sung by a vocalist. In Love You Too, the gat is basically what Westerners would call the verse and chorus. And Love You Too then closes with the drut, which is a concluding section played at a faster tempo, and often features more elaborate and energetic improvisation, as we can hear in Love You Too. The next track on Revolver is yet another pivot. We go from Harrison's version of Indian classical music to one of Paul McCartney's most tender and timeless songs.
To lead a better life, I need my love to be.
Paul has often cited Here, There and Everywhere as one of his favourite songs he's penned, and for this one he was very much taking influence from older music, from old American songbook tunes from the first half of the 20th century written by the likes of Cole Porter, Irving Berlin, George Gershwin. In particular, he was inspired by Cheek to Cheek, written by Irving Berlin. As Paul explains in this interview, he wanted to emulate in Here, There and Everywhere how Cheek to Cheek's lyric sort of folds into the next section.
I'm often asked what my favourite song I've ever written is, and I don't ever really want to answer it. But if pushed, I would go to Here, There and Everywhere. I think the structure of it, I like it. It always reminds me in structure of Cheek to Cheek, which Fred Astaire sang. And it starts off heaven, I'm in heaven, it goes through it. And then in the middle, it goes a lot, but it takes me back to heaven.
Will carry me through to heaven.
But I always thought, wow, that's a great trick, you know. So Here, There and Everywhere does that. Here, first verse, second verse, there, third verse. Everywhere.
There is to me everywhere.
Another feature of Here, There and Everywhere, which was also inspired by old American show tunes, is the song's intro.
Lead a better life. I need my love to be here.
A classic feature of old American show tunes is the opening section known as the verse. This opening verse would be a loose tempo, sort of melodically meandering introduction to the song.
My story is much too sad to be told.
Which would almost like set the scene before we kick into the main body of the song, and that main body was referred to as the chorus.
Fabulous face. I get no kick from.
And although weird today, this structure makes perfect sense when we remember that most of these old tunes were show tunes. They were from musicals. So this opening verse section is the character transitioning from just speaking dialogue to a song. Rather than just jumping straight into the song, they kind of introduced the song with this opening verse section. As Paul explains in this clip, these opening verses were a feature that John and Paul really enjoyed and was something they were keen to put into their own songs.
John and I were fascinated by this idea that in the old days, they did this complete ramble that didn't appear to be like about the song at all. It was an intro. They called it a verse.
And yet another thing akin to Cheek to Cheek and other older American Songbook or Tin Pan Alley songs is it has a key change for the bridge. The bridge is in a different key to the rest of the song. The verse is in the key of G major, but the chorus is in the key of B flat major.
Both of us thinking how good it can be. Say, I want her everywhere, and if she's beside.
Now for yet another stark contrast, track 6 on Revolver is Yellow Submarine, a jolly tune written by Paul McCartney and John Lennon together to be sung by Ringo Starr.
In the town where I was born lived a man who sailed.
Now the final version of Yellow Submarine we get is very fun, quite like a children's song, but the original song, the original idea for this song, was a much darker, sadder song written by John Lennon.
In the place where I was born, no one cared.
Now beyond the sadder, more autobiographical lyrics, John's original version of this song is using a time signature of 6/4 time, or what we can think of as 4 beats plus 2 beats.
The name when I was born, no one cared, no one cared.
Whereas the final version is in 4/4 time, albeit with a swing to
He
it.
told us of his life.
So when did John switch from having this version of Yellow Submarine with 4 beats, then 2 beats, to the version we have on the final recording where it's just 4 beats in every bar? Well, amazingly, there's another early demo recording, another tape that documents Paul McCartney helping John even out the timing of Yellow Submarine. We can hear on this version that John initially accidentally defaults to the way he wrote it with 4 beats followed by 2 beats.
In the town where I, oh no, that's the town.
That's why I get
Where I
going.
was born.
And then Paul points out that he needs to hang on the chord longer to add in those extra 2 beats into the bar, bringing us into a consistent 4 beats in a bar.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4.
In the town where I was born lived a man.
And for yet another insight in the development of Yellow Submarine, we can hear that the chorus originally had a very subtly different melody.
Look out, yellow submarine, get down, yellow submarine.
So the final version of Yellow Submarine didn't use that original time signature that John came up with, the 4 plus 2. But we can still see the influence of this original time signature in the version we got on the record in 4/4 when we look at where the chords change. The chords change in Yellow Submarine in this really uneven way where we get 3 beats of one chord and then it changes for 1 beat and so on.
Told us of his life in the land of submarine.
This 3 plus 1 pattern is the result of compressing down the 4 plus 2 pattern of the original version, of the original demo version of Yellow Submarine. So Yellow Submarine was constructed from a verse section written by John Lennon and a chorus that was seemingly written by Paul McCartney. But of course, one of the most essential parts of this song is the sound effects.
So we sailed on to the sun.
All of these special little moments creating that nautical atmosphere. To create the various sound effects and the sort of party vibe of this song, various guests were invited to the studio, including Brian Jones of the Rolling Stones, George Harrison's wife Patti Boyd, fellow musician Marianne Faithfull, who the Beatles had previously supported, the Beatles' road managers Mal Evans and Neil Aspinall, and the Beatles' driver Alf Bicknell. On verse 3 we get various sound effects, including Patti Boyd screeching, Brian Jones clinking glasses together and blowing on an ocarina. On top of this, to illustrate the moment after the lyric "and the band begins to play," George Martin and engineer Jeff Emerick cleverly managed to use an excerpt of a military band's performance of the French tune La Rêve Passée. George Martin and Jeff Emerick sampled a recording of La Rêve Passée from the EMI library of tapes. And if we listen to the original recording that was sampled from, we can hear that they chopped up elements of this recording. This splicing up of the recording was presumably done to make it fit musically in the gap in Yellow Submarine, and also perhaps to disguise the tune as to avoid any copyright issues. La Rêve Passée was written in 1906, which means that when the Beatles used it in 1966, it was 60 years old. So, as of today, there is now the same amount of time between La Rêve Passée and the Beatles using it in Yellow Submarine as there is between Yellow Submarine and today. August 1965, 1 year prior to the release of Revolver, the Beatles were staying in a house in Beverly Hills, California, enjoying a 6-day rest halfway through their US tour. One afternoon, John, George and Ringo took LSD. Various other guests joined them, including folk singer Joan Baez, Roger McGuinn and David Crosby of the Byrds, and, crucially for the story of our next song, actor Peter Fonda. During the resulting acid trip, Peter Fonda started retelling a story of when he had almost died from a self-inflicted gun wound as a child, claiming that he knew what it was to be dead. But John and George were not impressed by Peter Fonda and were finding him quite disturbing. Lennon explained in an interview in 1980, "We didn't want to hear about that. We were on an acid trip and the sun was shining and the girls were dancing and the whole thing was beautiful and 60s. And this guy, who I really didn't know, kept coming over wearing shades saying, 'I know what it's like to be dead.'" A few months later, in March 1966, John would funnel this experience into the song She Said, She Said. Originally entitled He Said, the song directly references Peter Fonda's claims of knowing what it was like to be dead. Now, in the same way that he abstained from the LSD trip that inspired this song, Paul McCartney is also not included on the final recording of She Said, She Said. Although there are conflicting reports, it seems that Paul had an argument with the rest of the band before the final version was laid down, and that the final bass performance on She Said, She Said is in fact performed by George Harrison rather than Paul. So we have this Beatles trio of George Harrison on bass guitar, lead guitar and backing vocals, John Lennon on lead vocals, backing vocals, rhythm guitar and also Hammond organ. And Ringo Starr on drums and shaker. And for this song in particular, I really think Ringo is the MVP. Ringo's drum performance here is so energetic and really drives the song. And it's a particularly impressive drum part considering that this song also changes meter a lot. Although it would become a staple of the Beatles' writing later on in their career, Revolver sees the first Beatles songs that diverge from being in one time signature. The first example of this actually came earlier on the album on Love You Too. But here on She Said, She Said, we have a very, very noticeable shift in time signature because the A section of the song, the main part, is in 4/4 time, but for the bridge we shift to 3/4 time instead. So we have 3 beats in every bar rather than 4, giving the music a very different feel. Now, from a harmonic perspective, She Said, She Said is a perfect example of what we would call the Mixolydian scale. This is in B-flat Mixolydian. Mixolydian is just like the major scale, but with a lowered 7th degree. That flat 7th degree makes the scale more bluesy. It's bright like major, but with a darker edge, and it's basically rock music's version of the major scale.
She said, I know what it's like to be.
So with that, we've completed the first side of Revolver. Flipping the disc over, we continue with this.
Good day, sunshine.
Good Day Sunshine is a deceptively unusual song. We open with the 6-bar chorus section, which is ultimately in 4/4, but it feels more like groups of 5 and 3.
Good day, sunshine. Good day, sunshine.
This chorus is in the key of B, but then when we go to the verse, we're dropping down a tone to the key of A.
Shine. I need to laugh, and when the sun is out, I've got some.
This verse section follows a fairly old-fashioned style of chord progression with what we call secondary dominant chords. A regular dominant chord is the 5 chord, the 5th chord of the key. So a secondary dominant is a 5 chord of one of the other chords in the key. For example, this F-sharp 7 chord doesn't really belong in the key of A, but it's serving here as the 5 chord, the dominant chord of the 2 chord B. So here we're getting this chain of dominant chords, creating this really bright chord progression.
And when the sun is out, I've got something I can laugh about.
Now in 1984, Paul admitted that Good Day Sunshine was inspired by The Loving Spoonful, specifically their song Daydream.
What a day for a daydream.
And beyond the sunny lyrics, it seems that Paul was perhaps also inspired by the chord progression here, because this chord progression that Paul's used with the secondary dominant chords is near identical to the chord progression we get in Daydream by Loving Spoonful. So the chorus of this song is in the key of B, the verse is in the key of A, and then the piano solo takes us to yet another key, the key of D major.
As they touch the ground.
And the piano solo is also not the work of one of the Beatles, but instead George Martin. Pretty much any time you hear a sort of fancy piano solo on a Beatles song, it will be George Martin at work. And if this song wasn't already complex enough, right at the end of the song, one of the lines of the chorus is not a combination of 3 and then 5 beats like it has been throughout the song, but instead a combination of 3 and 4 beats, skipping 1 beat.
Good day, sunshine. Good day, sunshine.
And right at the end of the song, we move to this F chord, effectively changing the key again, although it's almost like this key change doesn't get a chance to fully establish itself before the song fades out.
Good day, sunshine.
Track 9 on Revolver opens with Paul McCartney and George Harrison playing in harmony as they tear down the major scale on their guitars. This is, of course, And Your Bird Can Sing, but it didn't always sound this way. The original version is not only 1 tone lower in the key of D rather than the key of E, but also has a different sound, a sound so evocative of one of the Beatles' contemporaries that it probably should have been spelled And Your Bird Can Sing.
And your bird can sing, but you don't get me.
In addition to the jangly sound very evocative of the band The Byrds, this version also featured some whistling, perhaps to evoke birdsong. But of course the Beatles soon reworked this song, perhaps because it sounded too similar to the Byrds, and they decided to take the extended guitar line, which did feature in the original version, albeit just a single line of guitar, i.e. not harmonised. And they made this guitar line a much more significant part of the song, not only using part of it as the intro, but of course adding the higher harmony, creating that thick double guitar sound. Structure-wise, this song is very typical of the type of songs the Beatles had already written, opening with a main A section which gives you the main hook and main title of the song.
Everything you want, and your bird can sing, but you don't.
And then contrasting that with a middle 8, taking us somewhere else, particularly somewhere else in the key. Here, on this occasion, we move to the 3rd chord of the key, from which we get this descending line cliche.
When your prized possessions start to weigh you down.
A line cliche is just a fancy term for when you take a chord, usually a minor chord, and then you lower or raise one of the notes in the chord by a semitone each time. So here we're moving to this G sharp minor chord, and then the G sharp at the bottom of the chord goes down to G, then it goes down to F sharp, then it goes down to F natural, and eventually to E. At barely 2 minutes in duration, we tear through this song super quick, and we end in quite a peculiar fashion. We don't end on the one chord, on the chord of E, in the key of E, as you would predict. But instead we end like this. Although Paul McCartney's bass has gone to an E note, the tonic note, to finish the song off, the final chord of the song is A major, the 4 chord. So we get this A over E sound, this inverted chord, creating this sort of suspension at the end, this unresolved conclusion. And interestingly, the very next track on this album also ends in an unresolved manner, which we'll talk about in a while. But first, let's talk about how this song begins.
Your day breaks, your mind aches, you find that all our words of kindness.
For No One is an early example of a style that would soon be labelled Baroque pop. Pop or rock music that makes use of instruments more closely associated with Renaissance or Baroque music, like the harpsichord, or in this instance, the clavichord. The clavichord is a similar instrument to the harpsichord. Like the harpsichord, it's a precursor to the piano, a keyboard instrument where small metal blades strike metal strings, creating a bright, albeit quiet sound. On For No One, Paul plays both the clavichord and the piano, layering them in together. In addition to this, Paul also plays his bass, and although very quiet in the final mix, Ringo is playing drums and maracas.
She takes her time and doesn't feel she has to hurry. She no.
If we listen to the earlier Take 10 version of For No One, we can hear how the drums were originally a more significant part of the arrangement. We can also hear from this version that the instruments were originally recorded in the key of C major, not the key of B major. So one semitone higher, and also the tempo is faster. But this would have all been done intentionally because they then vari-speeded, they adjusted the tape speed down to bring the recording down to from the key of C to the key of B, which also in turn would have lowered the tempo. The Beatles played with tape speed like this on various occasions, usually in an effort to achieve an uncanny, weird sound to the music. The Beatles had used the exact same technique a few months prior on Rain, which was originally recorded in a much faster tempo. It was originally in the key of B flat and at this much faster tempo, but then later slowed down with vari speed, bringing it down to the key of G. Now, the standout moment in this song has to be the French horn solo, performed by Alan Civil. Although only a short solo, it's a very challenging solo because it's at the top of the French horn's range and actually asks for some notes which are beyond the traditional expected range of the instrument. But with Alan Civil being one of the leading French horn players in the UK at the time, he was able to meet Paul McCartney's very high expectation of hitting this particularly high note. The A section of For No One is based on this descending major scale chord progression, where you start on the tonic chord, in this case B major, and then you just go down one scale degree at a time. The B section of For No One contrasts this by moving to the key of C sharp minor. The chord progression here is simply just moving back and forth from C sharp minor, our new tonic chord, to G sharp, the 5 chord of C sharp minor. And then Paul very efficiently returns us to the key of B for the verse, and he leads in with a suspension, sus4, meaning that the 3rd degree of the chord has been moved up to the 4th degree.
Should have lasted years. You want her.
The particular use of C sharp minor in the B section here is what we would call C sharp harmonic minor, because Paul's using the major version, the dominant version of the 5 chord. This is very typical of classical music, and that coupled with the use of the sus4 chord here really paints in that classical sound. So this Baroque pop sound is not just down to the use of clavichord and French horn, it's also down to this use of classical-esque harmony. And in addition to this, another technique that's used in this song that paints into that classical world is counterpoint. Put simply, counterpoint is when you have a counter melody or various counter melodies happening at the same time as the main melody, creating this sort of woven web of melody. Later on in For No One, the horn solo that we've been introduced to earlier on returns, and it's overlaid over Paul McCartney's vocal melody. If we consider the bass line here to be a third melody, we could consider this a three-part counterpoint.
Your day breaks, your mind aches. There will be times when all the things she said will...
And as I alluded to earlier, this song ends without a full resolution. We get that familiar move from the F sharp sus4 to the F sharp chord, but now rather than returning to B major to have another verse section, we're just left hanging.
Lasted years.
Dr. Robert is John Lennon's upbeat, bluesy track about a doctor who prescribes a little bit more than just antibiotics.
Ring my friend, I said you called Dr. Robert.
In the exact same fashion as Good Day Sunshine that we heard a few tracks earlier, this song's verse section is in the key of A, whereas its chorus is in the key of B.
Dr. Robert, you're the new and better man.
We also get this bridge section in the key of B as well, where the upbeat rhythm falls away and the mood of the song changes quite dramatically.
You're feeling fine.
Listening to the earlier Take 7 version of Dr. Robert, we can hear that this dynamic change for the bridge wasn't originally as pronounced, because Ringo would continue playing through the bridge, rather than coming to a complete stop like he does on the final version.
You're feeling fine.
Next on Revolver, we would get something we'd never had on a previous Beatles album, a third George Harrison penned track.
I want to tell you.
I Want to Tell You is a deceptively unusual song. The verse is an uneven 11-bar loop.
My head is filled with things to say.
Now, although we can technically write this down as 11 bars, to be more accurate, it's actually kind of 10 bars, where we're in 4/4, but for these two chords, we move to 6/4. This is much closer to how it actually sounds.
My head is filled with things to say.
So we've got this weird meter thing going on in this verse, and on top of that, during the E chord, Paul McCartney is adding in this little trill between E and F natural, introducing an unnerving dissonance.
When you're here, all those words they seem.
After the verse, we move to the chorus, where the song continues to be quite weird, giving us an unusual and distinctive chord progression of B minor to B diminished to A.
But if I seem to act unkind,
And then we get a sort of extended version of that with B major going to B minor, then B diminished, and then A. So we're going through these three different types of B triad.
me, it's not my mind. That is confusing.
That takes us to the penultimate song on Revolver. Got to Get You Into My Life was Paul McCartney's attempt to create the American Motown or Stax soul sound. In fact, there was brief discussion of recording Revolver in America at Stax Studios, or maybe Motown's Hitsville, USA, or Atlantic Records Studios. But that didn't come to fruition, of course, and Revolver was recorded in England at Abbey Road Studios, but the band still strived to capture the American soul sound. And the most clear manifestation of this is the Beatles' first use of a horn section.
Another road where maybe I could see another kind of mind there.
The horns arrangement here wasn't scored out by George Martin. Instead, Paul McCartney sat down at the session with the 5 horns players and from the piano dictated what they should play. If we listen to one of the earlier versions of Got to Get You Into My Life, we can hear that a lot of the lines that the horns would play were originally performed by guitar.
I could see another kind of mind there.
Studio engineer Geoff Emerick played a big part in making the horns sound the way that Paul wanted. Firstly, Emerick went against the standard procedure at the time for Abbey Road Studios of miking horns instruments from about 6 feet away, and instead closely mic'd them, practically sticking the mic into the bell of the horn. Emerick then heavily limited the resulting high volume brass sound to create a super thick compressed tone. Despite this, Paul still wanted the horns to sound bigger, but when George Martin said that there was no budget to hire more horns players to add more overdubs, Emerick instead came up with the idea of printing the existing horn parts onto a separate track, then layering them on top slightly out of sync to double up the sound. The verse of this song is based on this vamp on the chord G, moving to an F over G chord.
What can I do? What can I be? When I'm with you, I wanna stay there.
For the next section, we move up to the third chord of the key B minor and have a line cliche descending from there. As you may remember, this is exactly what happened earlier on the album in And Your Bird Can Sing.
Ooh, and I suddenly see you. Ooh, did I tell?
And then the chorus of the song is really quite simple but effective. Paul singing the title hook lyric to this bluesy melody where we get the B flat over G, that blue note, the flat third.
Got to get you into my life.
And then this call from Paul is answered by this simple but effective horn slick. Although interestingly, listening to the earlier versions of Got to Get You Into My Life before they added the horns, we can hear that rather than this little horn slick replying to Paul's call of Got to Get You Into My Life, instead there was another line from Paul saying somehow, some way.
Got to get you into my life somehow, some way.
And with that, we're left with the first song the Beatles began work on for Revolver, although it would wind up being the last track on the track listing. As we can hear from the droning tambura, much like Love You Too, which we heard earlier on the album, Tomorrow Never Knows is John Lennon being inspired by Indian classical music. Tomorrow Never Knows was recorded a few weeks before Love You Too, making it the first Beatles song to use the Indian approach of only having one chord in the song. John was a little apprehensive to suggest this idea, but the other Beatles and producer George Martin were very open-minded.
So John showed up with this song after we'd had a couple of days off. I remember being in Brian Epstein's house in Chapel Street in Belgravia. We kind of met up, and John had this song which was all on the chord of C, which in our minds was okay, like Indian music's all on one chord, it's a perfectly good idea. I was wondering how George Martin was going to take it, because it was a bit of a radical departure, you know, at least we'd had 3 chords, and maybe a change for the middle 8 even, you know. Suddenly this was just John was strumming on C rather earnestly.
Tomorrow Never Knows also bends the Indian one-chord approach by superimposing a second chord over the drone to give a sense of harmonic movement.
It is not dying. It is not dying.
But what Tomorrow Never Knows lacks in harmonic complexity, it more than makes up for with groundbreaking studio sounds, like this one. The most striking thing about Tomorrow Never Knows is it introduces us to these sounds that are so unworldly. For example, that was actually a sitar being played backwards and sped up. And it was just one of the various tape loops that Paul McCartney prepared to sprinkle over the sound of this record. The other tape loops include this sound, which if we slow down we can actually hear as various layers of Paul McCartney laughing. We get this orchestral B-flat chord. This B-flat chord was most likely played on a mellotron, as are most of the loops here, and we hear it during that moment we were just talking about where it's layered over the drone of C to create a brief sense of harmonic motion.
It is not dying. It is not dying.
We also get this sound, which seems to be a clip of someone playing the flute setting on the mellotron sped up. And finally we get this sound, which is most likely the mandolin setting on a mellotron sped up. As Paul explains in this clip, these different loops fade in and out during the track to create the song's unique atmosphere.
I had 2 Brunel machines, and I used to be able to create tape loops with them. And so I brought a little plastic bag with about 20 tape loops in, and we got machines from all the other studios, and with pencils and the aids of glasses and stuff, got all these loops to run. And I think we I'm not sure, we might have 12 recording machines. We normally only needed one to make a record. We're all running with these loops, all fed through the desk. And then you just they were on, it's actually like how a lot of guys mix now. A lot of the dance people mix like that, get it all running eternally, and then pick into it and out of it.
John's transcendental lyrics for this song were adapted from a 1964 book, The Psychedelic Experience, a manual based on the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And this psychedelic subject matter is made even more trippy by the use of a Leslie speaker on John's vocals. Leslie speakers are traditionally used in conjunction with a Hammond organ. They're a rotating cabinet, literally a spinning speaker, which creates physically this sort of chorusing, fluctuating sound. Now, the song's title, Tomorrow Never Knows, doesn't appear in the lyrics itself. Instead, much like A Hard Day's Night, Tomorrow Never Knows was simply something that Ringo said off the cuff. In fact, we have video recording of when he said it in an interview in 1964, 2 years before John would turn it into a song.
You know, so you can't blame, you know, what can you say?
What can you say?
Oh, yeah. Tomorrow never knows.
George, how do you like being described as the Prime Minister's secret weapon?
It's sort of unbelievable that in the course of just 3 years, the Beatles went from a very conventional, albeit very catchy, rock and roll sound to this. And it's not just one new sound that the Beatles are bringing to the world here. Revolver is a revolving door of different sounds, different sound worlds, track to track, something that would become a staple of Beatles albums going forward. And yes, the Beatles may not have invented these new approaches or techniques, but in 1966 they were uniquely placed to introduce them to the entire world. They'd spent the last few years climbing to the top of the music industry by playing that industry's rules, by playing the role that was expected of them. And now that they had successfully got the attention of the entire world, they seized the opportunity to introduce that world to a whole new way of doing things. A whole new range of sounds, of ways of making music, of ways of writing songs, of ways of being a band. They created a whole new paradigm which would fundamentally change the scope of music from that point onwards. So let me know, what's your favourite song on this album? And if you're a fan of this new album breakdown format I've done today, then let me know what other albums you would like me to tackle in a future video.